I want to thank our sponsor, Newmark Watch Company, who are a British-owned brand and are one of the creators of the original RAF 6BB watches, which was part of the F-4 and would have been worn by Buccaneer, Harrier, Tornado and many other pilots and aircrew. Now the Newmark chronograph is back and updated, so you too can own a bit of RAF history. They also continue to award the Newmark Helicopter Flying Trophy each year at RAF Shawbury, where the trainee pilot with the highest marks is presented with the trophy and a 6BB watch. Make sure to visit their website at newmarkwatchcompany.com to discover their storied heritage collection, including the iconic 6BB pilot's watch alongside a Faithful Field watch and 2 stunning dive watch variations. Thank you and enjoy. So Mids, can you tell us all about Red Flag and how you became involved in the exercise?
Yeah, sure. I think probably best if I start with a little bit of context. So we started to get invited as a military to Red Flag in the 80s. Mostly ground attack guys, starting with Vulcan, and then the Harriers, the Buccaneers, the GRs started to go out. Started to find a place for air defence, mainly because the RAF wanted to go out and do some air defence stuff. But it was difficult because the invite was mainly for mud moving, bombing, that sort of stuff. In the mid-80s, the F-4 force got an invite to go out, and in 1987, I think it was, we sent the first 92 Squadron Detachment, or joint 92-19 Squadron Detachment from Germany. The benefit of Red Flag is the size of the exercise, location and the nature of what you do. So if you think about what we were doing in the 80s, UK-based squadrons would have most of their day-to-day stuff in training, so they'd be doing 4 ships or pairs, fighting internally in the squadron, fighting themselves. If you were doing affiliation, you'd have to organise it with another squadron, so maybe ring up a GR squadron, do some affiliation. You did a lot of upper air work, a lot of low level work. If you wanted to do anything more, large exercises, large scenarios where you were fighting a complex battle, then there were some exercises organised, but they were mostly UK defence over the sea and a much larger context. So large, complex missions weren't really being flown that much in the 80s. If you move across to Germany, the Germany squadrons had a completely different operation. They did a little bit of upper air work. Most of the stuff they did was down at low level. It was the air defence of the German mainland, along with NATO and everybody else, and it was orientated primarily as anti-Soviet low-level aggression, so it was all low-level air defence. What we needed and hadn't got was a broad spectrum exercise that covered everything from high level, medium level, live bombing, live ingress, and a realistic Soviet enemy. And that's what Red Flag was designed to provide, and the UK got invited out to it. So I got involved in the second deployment out to Red Flag with the Phantom, which was 1988. 19 and 92 squadrons deployed 8 aeroplanes across the Atlantic. To get ready for it, we had to kind of step out a little bit because our role was UK low-level air defence, sorry, Germany low-level air defence. We didn't do much tanking. We didn't do a huge amount of upper air work. So the workup involved tanking, so we could get out there, get back, and every Red Flag mission had tanking either before or after the sortie. So you could get to and from the exercise area and have enough fuel to fight, or lots of fuel to fight. And then we'd do some work with the E3s, because out there in Germany, we basically did low-level air defence autonomously on a cap, knowing roughly where the enemy would come from the east, and we'd have a gap normally between the Patriot belt or the Nike Hawk belt, and we'd have our area of responsibility and our direction to fight. So the amount of control you needed was really small. For the Red Flag exercises, you needed to have an active control of what was going on, so you needed to work with the E3 predominantly. So we would do a lot of work with the E3 and workup. We'd do some air-to-air combat, get used to some dissimilar stuff, maybe work with the NATO F-16s. So in the month before the exercise, we did lots of 4-ship size exercises, 4v4, 4v6, 4v8, 4v maybe something a little bit bigger, particular elements to get worked up. The squadron would then pick its crews. Most people wanted to go on Red Flag, but when you have a sortie that's, a profile of exercise that's going to run 2 4-ships each day, potentially a 6-ship at the end, you need 2 separate waves of crews to do that, so that's 8 crews. Each wave needs a supervising crew, so that's 10 crews altogether. Squadron only had 14 to 16 crews, depending on how it was. 2 crews would be in the Falklands, and 1 or 2 crews would probably be on leave or maybe detached somewhere. So in effect, there wasn't a selection process for red flag. The squadron just took everybody that was available, and that pretty much filled the aeroplanes. And indeed, I was on one of the second red flags I did with the F-4. We were 1 crew short, so 1 crew was kind of hopping from wave to wave. That made for some really long days. Deployment out there itself is, I was going to say, a bit of a trauma. It's a very complex and long-winded affair. So tankers from Germany out to the States, often stopping in somewhere like Goose or Gander in Canada for a night stop, then trundling across to Vegas, dropping into Nellis Air Force Base where Red Flag is hosted. You'd try and get there for Thursday, so you had Friday off, Saturday off to get over the time lag, the time difference, and just the long hours of getting there. 2, probably 6-7 hour legs normally over a couple of days to get there. And then on Sunday was the red flag master briefing. Everybody who flew on red flag had to be in the master briefing. It's as simple as that. And then we start flying on Monday. There would be a recce sortie where you just fly around the range, once clockwise, once anti-clockwise normally, and then you'd be sort of in theatre and ready to go. Flag itself, particularly in the 80s, was a massive exercise. So you have Nellis Air Force Base is Vegas. You have what we now know as Area 51, which we used to refer to as the container above it, and the red flag fighting space is above that, with Tonopah Air Base right up here in the top corner. So the red guys would go out one way and set themselves up, and the blue forces would go out the other way and set themselves up, and then at exercise on, you would approach each other. Blue would have an aim to come across to a target set here, often dropping live 1,000-pounders, which is particularly what the UK wanted to do, because our options to do that were quite limited at the time. And they would be escorted, there would be SEAD, and all the other things that you need to fly a package. Coming off tankers over here somewhere. And then over here, you'd have the red air guys, you'd have a cap, but they also had all of the Soviet SAM systems up as radar systems and guidance. You may have seen movies of that on YouTube and back on some of the stuff from the 80s, but would have SAM-2, SAM-6, the handheld stuff could be simulated as well. And those radars would feed cameras, and those cameras would feed debriefs for engagements. So the blue package would set off. Normally there'd be a sweep in front to deal with the Soviet fighters, which were F-5Es in those days from the aggressor squadron. The second lot through would be the SEAD guys, which were wild weasels, F-4 generally in the early days. I'll cover the later Tornado ones I did, but certainly in the 80s they were the F-4s. They would suppress the enemy's air defences, and then you would have several waves of attacking aircraft. Generally speaking, a series of 4 ships, which could be, in those days, Corsairs, Phantoms, F-111s. We sent Buccaneers, we sent Harriers, the Vulcans used to go out there, the Germans used to send Tornadoes. So you'd have a really broad spectrum of both nationalities and size to fire everything up. I think the first flag I did in '87 was about 120 combat aeroplanes on that. So a huge package with support. It often ran in 2 waves or up to 3 waves, but 2 waves, so you'd have 2 major fights separated by a brief time. But some of the assets would cover the whole thing. So coincident with our 2 fast jet fights up here, there might be a C-130 going round. And he would do a special forces insertion, drop the guys in red air, so he'd come all the way across, drop the guys in here to do targeting, lasing, for the first or second waves, and then he'd come all the way back, pick them up and go back the other way. And of course, his sortie would cover both waves of the fast jet stuff, because he's on a probably 2-hour sortie. The fast jet guys are doing 30-40 minute fights. So it's a massive exercise, and that was the huge benefit of doing red flag. You had this broad spectrum of types, broad spectrum of environment. You had a genuine Soviet laydown in terms of the simulated systems they were giving you, and you had an aggressor squadron that was purposefully designed to provide buddy tactics, the Soviet tactics at the time. One of the great advantages we had of going over from the air defence side, because they were struggling to find an escort role for us or a sweep role for us, certainly the first red flag I did in '87, we were Soviet, so we went across to be the baddies. That was absolutely brilliant, because what it gave us was a huge spectrum of targets to fight against. And the secret of what we were trying to do was first engagement, survivability and kill. So the way it worked, to give plenty of training, was you'd come into the merge normally with the sweep from the front of blue and us as red. You'd approach each other in the middle of that area at the top and start exchanging missiles, shots and all the other stuff. You would defend, so if you're approaching each other and you shoot missiles at each other, you can turn away. In those days, we were running Skyflash, which was a semi-active missile, which meant the host aeroplane, so if I fired my missile as a Phantom, I have to track the target with my radar for the entire flight of time of the missile, which means I have to keep trucking some way towards the target to be able to shoot him, because the radar energy from my radar is what the missile is homing onto. That meant that you could approach each other, but if you had to turn away, you'd lose your shot. Now you were balancing kill potential versus survivability. If you got shot, the beauty of Red Flag is it had an air combat maneuvering instrumentation system. Every aeroplane carried a pod on the Sidewinder rails that looked like a sort of training Sidewinder. It was actually a pod that radioed its location and position down to a central computer. That displayed it on a large screen, a la the original Top Gun when they're doing their debriefs. And that ACMI equipment would give real-time missile flyout and real-time kill verification. So you could shoot your missile, try to achieve your kill, perhaps have to go to defensive, and if you didn't get called you were killed, you know your defensive maneuver had probably been successful. On the other side though, if you shot your missile and didn't get called that you'd achieved a kill, you knew the guy was still alive. To give training benefit, if you got shot, you were vectored away from the flight. So you go north or south normally for 30 seconds to a minute. Once you were well clear of anybody that you were fighting before, you'd be called live and you'd be able to turn back round and come in. So you did get great training value if unfortunately you were shot in the face on the first engagement. You didn't just go home and spend the next 25 minutes sitting there doing nothing. So you'd have your real-time debrief, you'd have a variety of aeroplanes to fight, and you'd have real-time Soviet threats if you were on the blue side to do it. Our first flag was fantastic because we really joined the aggressors, so there would be 6 to 10 American aggressors and 4 to 6 UK assets, and we'd just join in on that side of things. Another flag I've done with the F-4 was the opposite. We were doing escort and sweep, so we go out in the front, start the fight, and do our engagements from there. The F-4, because of its simplistic weapon system, 60s weapon system, we were relatively successful, but particularly against the more modern threats like F-15, F-16, the aircraft was slightly outclassed, particularly in the medium air. We were very good in a complex bad weather, low level scenario, which we had in Germany, but on gin clear skies out in the desert, no, you were just working a lot harder to achieve the same. So that's kind of how the F-4 ones ran. When it came to the F-3, I did 2 F-3 ones in the 90s. Different aeroplane, more capable. We at first had the same semi-active missiles, the same Sidewinders as our secondary weapons, and we had the same levels of control. So we still had to support our missile in flight by the radar. We had a better understanding of E3 control because we used to use it a lot more in the Tornado in the UK, particularly in the UK scenario. We didn't really use it in Germany. And our main way of getting into the fight, understanding where the bad guys were, understanding what you had to do to fight them and what they were doing that you had to respond to at longer ranges, was something called broadcast control, where the E3 would have its radar picture. It could see us, it could see the enemy, but it couldn't vector each individual fighter to each individual target. The scenario was just too large for that. Too many fighters on either side, too many bombers in the blue package to make that viable. So depending on who you were, so let's say we're Red Air in our F-3 working with the American aggressors, you'd have a guy just dedicated to us, and he would call where the groups of the blue guys were relative to a point, generally speaking, in the range somewhere. If I pick the center of the range, just north of the container, then anybody coming in from the west would have 270, 20 miles, so you'd know where they were.
Right.
And anybody who was on our side from the east would be 030, 22. Because you don't tell the world where the bullseye is, whilst you might be able to work out where vectors are from each other, anybody listening in couldn't really work out where you were in the real world.
Right.
But of course, we knew where the bullseye was, we knew where we were, so you could work out where the enemy was. So if I was due east at 20 miles, and the enemy's called, in this case, blue air, due west at 20 miles, then you know you're 40 miles away, and it's due west to get to them. The maths is a bit more complicated if you're not on east-west pure vectors, obviously.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But you end up doing a lot about crunching the numbers in your head. That level of control meant that you would have a fighter controller literally just talking, no need to acknowledge. He'd be telling you where the enemy was. For us, as Red Air, that will be where the blue air guys are. On the times we were blue air, that will be where the red air guys were. And then you can make your decision on what you're going to do. So if you're Red Air, the aim is to get round the sweep or kill the sweep. If you can, kill the SEAD, because that's the protection they're looking for in the target area, but obviously disrupt the bombing force. If you can turn the bombing force round by attacking it so it doesn't drop its bombs, you don't have to shoot it down. And of course, with most of the small aeroplanes, good old V-Force Vulcans can fly for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours. Tornado doesn't, so Tornado is quite limited on the time it's got to be disrupted on the way to the target. So if you can disrupt bombers in a fast jet context on the way to the target, and they therefore run out of fuel and can't drop their bombs, you've actually done your job. You don't have to shoot them down. So half the game for Red Air would be perhaps to get round the fighters, not shoot them down, and then get into the bombers. So I went out with 29 Squadron as a guest in the early 90s. It was my first F-3 setup. The F-3 red flags were run in a very, very similar way. Slightly larger squadrons, so there was a little bit more of a choice in who went. We'd pick the more experienced guys. People would have a choice of whether they went there for. So some guys don't want to do a month away from home. They have personal reasons that they don't. So you'd always find a nice balance. Generally speaking, the people that went on the exercise were those that wanted to. That's kind of how it worked. Same deployment, you go over with tankers. In the F-3 we did a lot more medium to upper work, so our workup would include a lot more low-level work against low-level targets, and a bit more over land, because a lot of our role, particularly from the UK, was out in the east over the sea. Workup would be completed, didn't need to do the tanking because we did that all the time, didn't need to do the E3 stuff so much because we did that all the time. So the nature of the workup for the type was subtly different. From there, deploy out to the States, same time frame, same process, get the airplanes out there, get them on the ground, same briefings on the Sunday. I did one particular exercise where we used to run, for the F3 days, we used to run what we called little houses. So 4 blokes in a car, 2 blokes in an aeroplane. You'd work together, had rooms next to each other, travel to work together, fly as a pair together for the whole time. You'd do the workup together. And I worked with 3 other guys. I was the most experienced of those 3. Let's call them all Bob, shall we, for the benefit of it. And a typical example, never been to the States before. So on arrival on Thursday, get a little bit of America out your system. So go and have a look at the Hoover Dam, maybe.
Do the touristy things.
Do all the touristy things, a little bit of time around Vegas. And it was quite amusing because on the Saturday night, they ended up in Vegas doing their thing. And for Sunday, for the briefing, they'd not had a lot of sleep. So we went into the main briefing. We got that set up where it went, right, you must pay attention. This is the briefing. You must do everything on here or you can't fly. And I looked around and there's 3 guys behind me going, So the get Vegas out your system was really important before you went flying. Sometimes you might not make that, there might be an aeroplane delayed, but generally speaking, sorting out a few days to get arrived, get into theatre, get over jet lag, get the American out of your system was quite a nice thing to do. First sortie was always a famil. Now, Tornado had much better nav kit than the F-4. So in the F-4, we really just had a TACAN, a stopwatch and a map. So you had an electronic aid that told you range and bearing from a beacon. That was pretty much it. No moving maps, nothing like that. And you would then use a map and a stopwatch and you'd time yourself along routes to where you went. Wow. The first arrivals I did in the 1990 red flag, we did our NavX and the lead nav got the timing wrong and we chunked all our way up and then all turned left about halfway up the container. So we're all heading into what is now Area 51 that everybody understands. The system works that they have a common frequency for everything. They actually use guard 243.0, and if there is a note on guard, they will just call everybody to turn a certain way. And God bless us, we got the turn north now for everybody. Everybody turned north. We didn't fly into the container. Flying into the container was a go home now kind of situation. Really? Right. So that's just one of those things. F3's nav kit was far, far better. So if you went into the container, you were really not paying proper attention to the nav. Still had to do the familiarisation around the site though. Look at the bombing area, look at the target area, look at the sweep area. If you were red air, and again I did one of each, one blue, one red with the Tornado. If you were red, you'd look at where you were going to cap your defensive area. You'd still go out and have a look at the blue area so that you had an idea of what it looked like, where they were, what they were doing. Blue would go all the way to the targets and back and around so you saw everything. That first flag was a similar level of control, so bullseye control. We had similar weapons in Skyflash and Sidewinder, so whilst the aeroplane was more capable, had a much better nav kit, you were still doing the same levels of control.
Right.
For me, the big game changer that happened was during the gap between my two red flags, we brought link 16 into service, JTIS. Link 16 is a data link. So what that gave us was a far, far greater understanding of what was going on. We could see more on our own map views of the radar picture, the target picture. So before, where we were listening to aeroplanes on the bullseye control, so we were listening to the position given to us by fighter controllers, we could actually see those formations on the radar. That made the aeroplane far, far more effective. It also meant that when you were doing your attacking, defending thing, you could actually see where the vectors went for the enemy's aeroplanes. So if you're going to shoot at each other like this, but there's two of us like this, and this guy goes there, he's targeting this guy, you can guess that you're untargeted. So a small manoeuvre this way will give you lots of space to generate to turn round. We had great success on that red flag. We got a 5-to-1 kill ratio in our favour in the steam-driven F-3 against F-15 and F-16.
That's impressive.
Because the kit and the levels of kit that we had in that aeroplane at that time were literally world-leading. Later on in its life, it got AMRAAM and it got ASRAAM, much more capable weapons, and it became a really formidable piece of kit. It was never going to be a 9G F-16 fighter, but for what it was designed for, bad weather, UK air defence with all those systems, F-3 was really good. And it pretty much shone out on red flag. We always did fairly well in the early days. Once we got Link 16 and we could use our full weapon suite, it was absolutely fantastic aeroplane. It was also great fun. So on the last red flag I did, we were blue air. And because the aeroplane could go so fast at low level, we were asked to escort the B1s in. So the B1 can do pretty much supersonic. The deck level at red flag is about 5,000 feet above sea level in places, 2,000 to 5,000. So you can be supersonic on the deck, and because the area is cleared, there's no people, nobody worries. Be about 2,000 to 5,000 feet AGL, so the speed of sound is slightly slower than it is at sea level. The B1s could do supersonic dashes, we could sit with them, in fact we could accelerate ahead of them. They could do it for an hour and 10 minutes, we could do it for 15. But so there is a big difference, but we were asked to escort the B1s in, which was absolutely fantastic to do. On one of our missions, we decided that we'd have a look and just see how fast the aeroplane would go. So we arranged. The excuse was that we wanted to escort the B1s and see how fast we could get ahead of them if needed, but it was really just to see how fast you could go on the deck at 250 feet. 4-ship, line abreast, onto the deck, well supersonic, about 1.2 Mach.
Would you be clean at this point though?
Clean with just simulated weapons. Absolutely fantastic to do, and the aeroplane was really moving. The F-3, when it got going, and you got to high speeds, you used to get a hum and a noise over the airflow, and the aeroplane would sing to you, so you could almost feel what the airflow was doing. Really, really great to do. So we did a high-speed run across the range at low level, which was just great. On landing, we all got arrested. And we all got arrested because somewhere on that road there was somebody in a Winnebago, and the claim was that we'd actually blown him off the road with the shockwaves. What actually happened was the bloke was distracted by us going over and lost control of his Winnebago. But when we actually saw the pictures of it, which was sent down a few days later from the traffic police up in the range area, this literally was all that was left of his Winnebago, was a chassis with a steering wheel and a seat in the middle of the desert.
And you didn't even see him?
Didn't even see him, no. But he had obviously got distracted by us, lost it on the edge of the road and rolled his vehicle over. So sometimes it was great to do. But the real thing was that aeroplane was incredibly fast. So we were often invited to just escort the B1s across the line. So there'd be 2 B1s, 4 F3s, and we'd do close escort for them against the other bad guys.
And did they think you could keep up with them, or was there a bit like, nah, you can't do it?
Oh no, they knew we could keep up with them. But they knew we could keep up with them for the run to the target, not for the full ingress. So we'd come off a tanker, run to the target, go back to the tanker, and then go home. The most dangerous thing, I think, in any red flag was the departure and the recovery from Nellis. So to get a 1980s one done, when you probably had 120 aeroplanes to get off, you'd all get airborne in your set time slots. If you taxied too far apart, some of the formation would slot in the gap between to get off early or to get in the way, so you'd taxi really tightly. You taxi to, Nellis has 2 parallel runways that sit like this with joining taxiways at the ends. So you'd taxi all the way out to the end, and depending on which runway you had for takeoff, you would either taxi onto the runway and take off, or cross the runway and hold on the other side. And then the tower controllers at Nellis wouldn't talk about single aeroplanes, they only ever talked about formations. And your formation would get its call sign, clear takeoff, and you acknowledged, and that was it. You just went, because it had so many aeroplanes to move. 2 runways for takeoff was fine, because you did sequence left, right. So while one was on the runway taking off, the other would be lining up and getting ready. For recovery, it was far more complex because you only had one recovery path down.
Oh, really?
You'd charge down at the airfield. The normal break was to the right, away from the mountains at Vegas, but the Sunrise Mountains on the left could give you an optional break. So what you do is you'd come down the approach, you'd come as a formation, maybe 4 aeroplanes. If there was another formation near you, they would go VFR, visual behind you. The phrase that's used is MARTA, military accepts responsibility for separation of aeroplanes.
Right.
So you'd start with radar feed-ins. The moment you could see each other, you'd declare MARTA, and you'd follow the formation in front.
Right.
You'd pass an initial point, turn over from the radar approach frequency to the tower, and then the tower you would just call at the IP, the initial point, add your call sign, and the controller will tell you which way to brake and which runway you're on. So you might brake to the left, so you get a sunrise brake, but to land on the right-hand runway, or you might get a standard brake to land on the right, or you might get the opposite and land on the left, or a sunrise to the left to land on the left. And what they were doing was sequencing you onto the runway so that the runway was never overfull of aeroplanes, and that the brakes were all happening so that you weren't in each other's way. And of course, if you have 2 runways like this, and you're doing 2 patterns like this, you can both come into the runways together without being in the way.
Yeah.
That was probably the most dangerous thing we did, simply because you'd have perhaps 20 formations. They'd all be coming home. They'd all be short of gas. All the fast jet guys would be on absolute minimums. There wasn't any time for faffing around. And of course, when you land, if you land on the Sunrise runway, when you get to the far end, you can't cross the other runway if aircraft are landing on it. So you would park lots and lots of aeroplanes in the gap between the 2. And at some point, you'd be called to cross the runway, and you would all charge across the runway and out the other side. So the choreography was amazing. And the tower guys who were running the air traffickers who were doing that choreography were absolutely fantastic. It's an incredibly busy 25 minutes, and then it all goes quiet for about 4 hours, and then they do it all again. So it's absolutely brilliant. And when I think about it, the planning cycle is a 12-hour cycle. So for the mission, which is effectively 40 minutes, you would have some lead-in meetings and synchronization meetings. So you'd know the time on target for the blue guys, if you're blue. You'd know the start point for blue. You'd all then have to work out what time to get together, when the escort went, what the TOT was, all based on the attack profile for the time on target of a bomb. So everything will be plotted back from that. The mud guys would then go away, and they'd have their planning mission where they do their targeting and their weaponeering, and they work out what weapons they need for what target, how many they're going to drop. For flag, it was often, this is all the weaponeering, but we're actually just going to drop 1 live 1,000-pounder for training. But they'd still go through all that process. The air defenders would have an escort plan, but our process was probably an hour, and the mud's process was probably 3. So we had a thing called the very famous air defence coffee break, where we were going to have coffee for an hour.
I like that.
Then you get back together, you brief the whole package. So again, the brief starts at takeoff times. So everybody gets their takeoff time to transit to the north to get a tanking slot. You all fill up to full on the tanker. You then push forward to a point, which is the push point, and then you push in sequence from there. And that's all that timing is to drop a bomb here on time. Right. But the plan is then briefed in real time, starting with your takeoff time.
Wow.
Once you've dropped your bomb, you've got to plan an egress. So the guys that are doing sweep will run forward of everything else. Their aim is to push back the Soviet fighters and generate safe space. Once that's done, the SEAD goes in and suppress the enemy air defences. Then the bombers all run through, while the fighters and the SEAD guys stay over the enemy or target or in a particular place. And then once the bombers all turn around and gone home, the SEAD guys come back. So it's quite a complex choreography. So those air defenders and SEAD guys are always short fuel, because they're not only are they the guys that are first in, last out, but the ones that need reheat to turn and burn as well. So they're using lots and lots of fuel to do that.